this event to discuss the events in Bahrain and the recent report of the Commission. Just going to introduce briefly the members of the panel, and then we'll have some remarks from Senator Wyden. Just immediately to my left, Senator Ron Wyden, first elected to Congress in 1980 to represent Oregon's 3rd District, and elected to the Senate in 1996. To his left, Brian Dooley is the director of the Human Rights Defenders Program at Human Rights First. To his left, Toby Jones, an assistant professor of history at Rutgers University, where his research focuses primarily on the political history of the Middle East. And finally, to his left, Andrew Exum, a senior fellow at the Center for New American Security. I'm going to turn it over to Senator Wyden first. He has a bit of a time crunch. He's going to give us a few comments about Bahrain and then take a few questions. So thank you, Senator.
Thank you, and let me start. My staff wrote this wonderful, lengthy speech, and I believe on a Monday I should spare you the trauma of all of that, and maybe I can just put this in the congressional record and mail it to you, so you will not get a filibuster. But I especially want to thank the Project on Middle East Democracy. This is an important time, an important discussion. And for all who've been democracy activists in the Middle East, on particularly the Project on Middle East Democracy, I would simply want to convey, I believe all your hard work is truly paying off. As you all know, the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry put out its report, just put it out recently on November 23rd. And the Commission confirmed what others who have been following human rights issues have been saying for some time, and that is that there were human rights violations that took place during the protests that began earlier this year. The Commission documented reports of torture, including deaths that resulted from that torture, masked men beating Bahraini citizens in their own homes in the dead of night, and mass firings, not an occasional firing, of those who supported the protests. They found that repression was widespread, repression was systemic. As you also know, on September 14th, the Obama administration notified the Congress of its intent to sell Bahrain $53 million worth of weapons. So in effect, the Obama administration was looking to make a major arms sale to the very same regime that had been violently cracking down on its own people. And suffice it to say, it was a pretty significant array of weapons: 44 Humvees, 200 wired-guided missiles, 50 bunker-busting missiles, missile launchers, and night vision sets. My own view is our country should not be rewarding a regime that fires on peacefully assembled protesters and one that is indiscriminately imprisoned its citizens simply for voicing a political viewpoint. That's why I introduced Senate Joint Resolution 28, which would stop the proposed arms sale to Bahrain unless key conditions were met. My colleague, Congressman Jim McGovern from the House of Representatives, joined me in that effort. Now, after we introduced our resolution, and after several colleagues from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee joined me in raising this issue with Secretary Clinton, the administration agreed to carefully review the Commission's recommendations and consult with the Congress before proceeding with any additional steps that would relate to the arms sale. I believe the Independent Commission's report has shown the wisdom of stopping that arms sale. And just for a minute, imagine if the Congress had just kept quiet. Imagine if everybody in the Congress had just sat this out and the arms sale had been completed. What kind of message would that send to the world and to people throughout the world who aspire for freedom and democracy? For me, this is very simple. Our country should not be rewarding brutal regimes with arms. Now, of course, we've had the chance to review the Commission's findings, and it's clear to me that the Bahraini government must immediately begin to implement the reforms that have been recommended by the Independent Commission. That would include, certainly not limited to, holding all public officials accountable for their role in the abuses, reforming the Bahraini National Security Agency, Ministry of Interior, and Bahrain Defense Forces, all of which were involved in the systematic issue of torture against protesters, and implementing legislative changes as recommended by the National Commission that is being formed. Moreover, progress must also be made in several areas that weren't covered by the Commission's report. While the Commission's recommendations are necessary, in my view, they don't go far enough. Because of its narrow mandate, the Commission was not able to touch on several other issues that, in my view, also need to be addressed. In addition to the report's recommendations, I'd like to see the Bahraini government make significant and measurable progress on several other issues before our country proceeds with an arms sale. The government of Bahrain should allow and fully cooperate with independent human rights organizations and observers, specifically UN bodies such as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and allow for an investigation of claims of human rights abuses, and also to monitor the government of Bahrain's progress in adopting the Commission's recommendations. Second, the government of Bahrain should unconditionally release peaceful members of the opposition who have been detained without charge or convicted and who have been sentenced for political offenses. Third, the government of Bahrain ought to allow access by local and international journalists to activists, protest sites, hospitals, and public institutions generally. The regime must also make measurable progress in reforming the government of Bahrain to provide citizens with a larger role in deciding who governs them and ensuring that all Bahrainis have equal representation. Until measurable progress is seen on these fronts and on the recommendations made by the Commission report, I plan and will pursue vigorously my objections to the proposed arms sale to Bahrain. I agree with what Secretary Clinton said several weeks ago. Meaningful reform and equal treatment is in Bahrain's interest, in the region's interest, and ours. I hope that the State Department is now taking a hard look at this report and realizes that now would not be the time to reward the government of Bahrain with an arms sale. We all understand that the Middle East is going through seismic change. That's why it's important for policymakers to underscore that the right decisions are made during a formative period in the region. All our actions ought to reflect our support for democracy and need to be consistent with American values and American ideals. As I indicated, rewarding regimes that violently suppress peaceful civil dissent and violate human rights with multi-million-dollar arms sale is just inconsistent with the values that we believe in so strongly as Americans. Our country and Bahrain have a long history of cooperation and partnership. It's often said that they are one of our best friends in the Gulf region and serve as an important strategic ally against Iran. I don't question any of that. What I disagree with is that this concept of friendship, then earns a regime a free pass to kill and torture its own people and create a culture where your religion determines if you can work in government or join the police force or play soccer. Being friends with Bahrain should make it easier for our country to point out when that government goes astray, not harder. That's, in my view, what friends do for each other. This is our opportunity to warn friends in Bahrain that their current path leads towards peril. The people of Bahrain are not going to stop pushing for freedom. They're not going to stop pushing for equal opportunity. They're not going to stop pushing for representative government. Like people everywhere, they thirst for equality and a chance to control their own destiny. The transition may be gradual. We can't predict that, but it has to begin now. Or, as we've seen, the country of Bahrain and potentially the entire region will be rocked by further instability. Bahrain certainly has much work to do to properly address the atrocities that were committed early this year. My hope is the government will do what's best for its people and will implement meaningful and serious reforms. I hope that all the parties will engage in an honest and substantial national dialogue to address the past so that the country can move forward together. And certainly all would agree without genuine and representative dialogue, progress is that much harder to achieve. Let me close by saying I believe that there is widespread appreciation for the Commission's efforts to produce a quality report. They had a limited mandate, and they made important recommendations. I believe the text provides all interested parties with what I would consider a good starting point for the process of reconciliation and progress towards a more democratic and inclusive society. We have an opportunity to see concrete and measurable results in the months ahead. It's not going to be easy, but I know that Bahrain is capable of moving forward and that in the end, the alliance between our countries is going to endure, it is going to prosper, it is going to be better for the work we are trying to do today to protect freedom and those who are speaking out in Bahrain. Let me use that as kind of an opening salvo. Softball questions are always especially welcome, and I really do got to sprint back to the hill, but let's see if anybody has a question or two. Yes.
If you could just state your name and affiliation.
Hussein Abdullah, Director of Bahraini Americans Advocacy Group. The report, besides stating the human rights violations, also talks about that they could not find any evidence, or the Bahraini government could not give them any evidence that Iran was behind the uprising or the peaceful protest in the country. Will that make the case easier for the Congress to advocate for some kind of political change or political reconciliation, maybe a constitutional monarchy in Bahrain, to prevent further disruption? Because it looks like that's the demand of the majority of the people. Especially, there is no tie between Iran and Bahrain. And that's what the Bahraini officials, whether they come to the State Department, member of Congress, the White House, were claiming that if we help the protesters, we're going to embolden Iran and Bahrain. Thank you.
I think it is too early to tell how it's going to play out specifically with respect to a certain type of government. But certainly the finding that this was not in any way hot-wired by Iran will help all those in Bahrain who are speaking out for a change in government and for an end to these kinds of practices. So put me down as interested in the concept and would be pleased to work with a variety of citizens groups who are looking at that issue. Specifically on the type of government, I would say too early to tell, but certainly as a result of the finding that this was not in any way inspired, advanced by Iran, but was the genuine outpouring of the people, increases the options for moving forward in a progressive fashion.
Thank you. Emily Cadet with Congressional Quarterly. I was wondering, you mentioned that the White House has committed to participating in a review and consulting with Congress. Have you had any actual consultations since that decision? Do you expect to have more? Have you gotten a sense of the evaluation, and what's your sense of the timeline for their evaluation?
My sense is, as you know, the Secretary has been traveling just in the last week. The Department's got a lot on its plate, but I think the fact that now there is bicameral interest in this has given this more visibility and more attention. I think we're talking about weeks rather than months in terms of the department laying out its next approach. I can't speak for them, but they certainly have picked up that there is significant interest in both the House and the Senate. And anyone who follows Secretary Clinton's travel schedule knows that she has a lot on her plate. But I think the combination of congressional interest plus the powerful findings of the analysis have made it clear that they're going to have to move more quickly, and I believe we're talking about weeks, not months.
Yeah, I'm Joost Hilterman with the International Crisis Group. This is the report. I'm just plowing through it. It's 500 pages, and it's fascinating reading, of course. I'm an old human rights junkie, so I get into this stuff. But it's also, of course, highly distressing. And when you read it, the cumulative effect is that you understand this is not about a human rights issue. There was a human rights crisis, obviously, but it goes well beyond that. It's about security forces essentially taking revenge against another population for having the temerity of standing up and calling for their democratic rights. And so I wonder now, the response from the Bahraini government may well be to set up another commission to address such and such issues. As you said, this commission's mandate was narrow, and so the recommendations are limited. I'm worried that we're going to have some kind of human rights response, some reform in the security agency, some people may be prosecuted. But we're not actually addressing the basic political question, which is one of lack of reconciliation between two groups, government and a population that are very much at odds. And I'm just a little bit worried about what the administration here might do, that it might just go for the lowest common denominator and sort of support any kind of human rights measures, which are important in their own right for confidence building, but don't go far enough at all. I just wonder what you see your role in Congress is in putting pressure on the administration. Thank you.
You raise a particularly important question, and I went to school on a basketball scholarship, and you always tried to take one shot to quit on, sort of. You hoped you made it. And to me, and this is why I stressed that the commission, in my view, had a pretty limited mandate. It's why I laid out that I thought there were other issues. And to me, what you're raising is this once again going to get what amounts to sort of low-hanging fruit kind of remedies, and the major questions of what it's going to take to ensure real rights, real freedom for the people is going to be swept under the rug for yet another time. And that's why I've tried to make clear that I am going to continue to advance this point of holding off on any arms sale unless there are real reforms. So for all of you that have worked so hard, where is Isaiah Aiken? Isaiah Aiken is here in my office. He's our staffer who handled this. You can call him nights and weekends and take all his free time. But the point is, and it is a very appropriate question, at least to wrap up my portion, we need your input. We need your good work on the ground in the region to make sure that the changes there are not cosmetic, are not just the low-hanging fruit of putting a small number of people in jail or something of that nature, but really advance the kind of reconciliation you're talking about. And I'm in this to go the distance. It was clear to me on the basis of the significance of the evidence that this was time to not just speak out and make it clear that the action in Bahrain and what the protesters were facing was inconsistent with our values. It was time to not just speak out, but to stay with it and to continue to prosecute the cause of freedom and to cite the fact that with our relationship, our friendly relationship with the Bahrain government, we are in a position to tell them that this is going to be something we are not going to gloss over. We are going to stay with until there are real changes. I know you're going to have a good conference. Keep Isaiah busy in the days and weeks ahead. because I think this really, there are times when you look at parts of the world and you say, well, perhaps our involvement can make a difference at some point. This is a time, just as that last question raised, that is going to be transformative. And we're either going to make a small number of modest kinds of changes, or we're going to set in place the policies of freedom that really will advance the kind of reconciliation that last question discussed. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Senator Wyden. And as I neglected to mention during my introduction, my name is Matthew Duss. I'm a policy analyst at the Center for American Progress. It's a real privilege to be part of this panel moderating this discussion with these gentlemen. I'm going to go first to Brian. Brian, you were in Bahrain for the release of the Commission's report. You wrote a really good article for the Huffington Post talking about the great fanfare with which it was released and given to the King. What are some of your impressions, and where is this going to go?
Well, here is the report. It was released with great fanfare a couple of weeks ago in a room much bigger and much posher than this. In terms of numbers, pages 500, budget 1.3 million. Sharif Bassiouni's personal salary for that time was $22,500 a month. Hours to read, 9.5. Number of arrests, 2,929. Number of dismissed workers, 4,539. Number of deaths, 35. Number of deaths in custody, 5. Number of ministers who've resigned, 0. What the report doesn't have are names of people who were guilty of these crimes, or even the ranks of those who were guilty for ordering this stuff. The closest it gets is paragraph 1179, where it talks about the pattern of illegal arrests, the large number of arrests, many of which happened during the middle of the night with masked men. And it says a systematic pattern of behaviour about these illegal arrests could not have happened without the knowledge of higher echelons of the command structure of the Ministry of Interior and the National Security Agency. But really that's as far up the chain as it's prepared ever to identify in the report, as far as I can see at least. What the Bahrain government has done since is to set up a commission to look at the implementation for how it might implement the recommendations in the report. That's supposed to report sometime by February. It seems to have engaged the services of the former Miami police guy, John Timoney, and the former Assistant Commissioner to the Metropolitan Police in London, John Yates. The National Security Agency was singled out for particular criticism in the report, and the head of the NSA has been moved. Khalifa bin Abdullah has been removed from that post and promoted to the cabinet. He's now the Secretary General of the Supreme Defence Council. I know it's only been a couple of weeks since the report was out, and not all of these things not all of the recommendations could be implemented overnight, but I draw your attention to paragraph 1722G, which recommends that all official interviews with detained persons be recorded audiovisually in an obvious attempt to prevent or at least reduce torture. That could be done very quickly, and that hasn't been done yet so far. In fact, the response has been pretty discouraging overall, I have to say. The report was released November the 23rd. On the 28th, the doctors, the medics were back in court. On November the 30th, there was a batch of teachers back in court. Yesterday, there were 7 guys sentenced to a year in prison each by the military court for their perceived association with the protests. So in terms of response, there has been some rhetoric, some need, says the King, for urgent reform. But on the ground, the prosecutions are carrying on. The people who should not be in prison are still in prison. People who we, other leading international human rights organisations, and the Bassiouni report have singled out as cases where the charges ought to be dropped because there was no due process. Those people haven't been released, and people continue to be prosecuted. The report, as the Senator had mentioned, told us roughly what we already knew, that there was, quote, paragraph 1238, a systematic practice of physical and psychological mistreatment which in many cases amounted to torture, with respect to a large number of detainees in their custody. And in fairness to Sharif Bassiouni, at the launch a couple of weeks ago, he stood there in front of the King and about 600 of us and listed some of these techniques: the beating, the forced standing, the electric shocks, cigarette burning, beating on the soles of the feet, sleep deprivation, threats of rape against both the detainees and their female relatives, and some people were hung from their arms while they were being tortured. On the arms sale, I think it's important to note that Human Rights First had detailed some evidence about the direct complicity of the Bahrain Defence Forces in some of these human rights violations, going back over several months, because some of the reasoning we heard for the arms sale was that the arms were being sent to the military as opposed to the police, and really the military weren't involved to much of an extent in the repression. The Bassiouni report found BDF, the Bahrain Defence Force, responsible for several of the deaths. We have detailed torture in the BDF hospital aimed at patients. We and the Bassiouni report detail attacks on patients and doctors at the Salmania hospital by the BDF. The BDF, according to the Bassiouni report, arrested over 100 people, and the BDF were responsible for mistreatment and torture of detainees. So the idea that it's all right to sell arms to one branch of the security forces because they're not the bad guys is dubious in the first place. But even if you are going to pursue that argument, there's plenty of evidence to show that the military were indeed directly implicated in many of these violations. In terms of what should happen next, the US really needs to tell the Bahraini government loudly, publicly, clearly that it won't sell it the arm, it won't sell it the weapons until these violations stop and those guilty are held accountable. It ought to publicly declare that the relationship it has with Bahrain is dependent on human rights and the human rights performance of the Bahrain government. The government of Bahrain should, as a first step, implement all of the recommendations in the Bassiouni report. It should drop the charges which are politically motivated against people it's prosecuting, should let people out of prison if they're in prison simply for the peaceful expression of their views. It should allow access to journalists and NGOs. There was a worrying conversation that some of us had with the Minister for Human Rights and Social Development the day after the release of the report, where we pressed on this issue of access because some people from some NGOs and many journalists over the last few months have not been allowed into the country. And the response was very worrying because they seem to be saying, why would you want to come anymore? We've got the report. You've all done these investigations. We put an end to that by commissioning our own report, and here is the truth. Why would you want to come to do any more investigations? I suspect that Human Rights First and other international human rights organisations will be very keen on getting into Bahrain in the coming months, and I would urge the government of Bahrain to let us in because it's more trouble than it's worth to keep us out. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Toby, could you talk a little bit about the impact of the report on the opposition movement, some of the implications for any kind of agreement, reconciliation? Is that more or less likely in the wake of this report?
Right. Thanks, Matt. Thanks to POMED for organizing the panel and for inviting me down today. Bahrain desperately needs a game changer. The political situation remains dire. After a lull in violence over the summer and early fall, there's been an escalation in security response to small protests, civil disobedience across the island in recent months. On the same day that Bassiouni delivered his remarks in a press conference, not only in front of the king, but also in front of the Prime Minister, the Crown Prince, Bahraini security forces killed a young Shia protester in the village of Ali, just a few miles away. The situation is dire. Bahrain desperately needs a political mechanism, a set of instruments, and the political will on the part of its friends to help it find a way forward. I see nothing in the Bassiouni report that suggests that such a development is imminent. The Bassiouni report was commissioned with one specific mandate, or at least one very clear mandate, and that was to provide a narrative of events February, March, the spring 2011. But there was an implicit, understood political objective. There were two. Neither of these have been accomplished. The first one was to create a set of political conditions for resolution, a narrative that would create goodwill on the part of the opposition. And we have to understand that the opposition in Bahrain is not a monolithic thing. It's composed of different components. There are Shia members of the opposition. There are secular Sunni members of the opposition. But even within those two communities, there are divergences of opinion about what will be a meaningful or satisfactory political resolution and what the terms of sort of rapprochement might look like. For their part, their response to the BICI report has actually legitimized the narrative of the protest. It has sort of confirmed every critical thing that they've said over the last 10 months in the face of considerable government pressure, criticism, denial, threats, and sort of claims of conspiracy. So the report, by not speaking directly to their sets of political concerns, has actually empowered them and sort of encouraged them to dig in. There doesn't seem to be the kind of movement on their part that would allow them to move forward. And the reason for that is that the report also fails to outline, and most importantly, a set of political mechanisms that would make clear what the regime's political responsibilities are moving forward. It's very clear what it is that the government needs to do. And it's been very clear for the better part of a decade. We're caught up in the spirit of the Arab Spring, events over the last few months, not only in Bahrain but elsewhere, and how sudden this seems to be. The reality in Bahrain is that Bahrain's civil society and its government has been locked in a protracted, intractable discussion and confrontation about the best way to resolve what has been a long-standing set of political issues, about the fairness of the Constitution, the fairness of elections, sectarian discrimination that's built in structurally in the political system, about political rights, about opening avenues for participation, ending corruption, and justice for an earlier era of torture that happened in the 1990s, none of which have been resolved over the last decade and which spilled into the streets just in the last year. So the BICI Commission report was also meant, I think, by the powers that be outside of Bahrain that encouraged its creation and that it moved forward, was meant to create a set of political mechanisms, or at least it was hoped that a set of political mechanisms would be created for the government to be able to address all of those things, and that might empower more reasoned voices inside the Al Khalifa royal family to create an opening and to revisit the possibility of political reform. Not only did the report not encourage the opposition to come to the table, it has also not empowered what a lot of folks in this country and elsewhere are calling the moderates in the Al Khalifa family. So the moderates are often identified as the crown prince and the king. It's widely understood that in the spring, the Prime Minister of Bahrain assumed control not only of the security response but also of the political situation more generally. If the BICI Commission report was meant to give an opening or create an opening for the Crown Prince to reassert himself, to recreate momentum towards a national dialogue, it's far from clear that it's done that. And it's frankly, it's impossible to tell what it might take for the Prime Minister to relinquish power. So from where I sit, as a political analyst of the situation, the report has achieved one thing so far, and that's providing a damning narrative of the security crackdown and the excessive use of force. And it makes explicit that the regime bears full responsibility for the course of events of earlier this year. But it's a failure politically so far. Bahrain is no closer to a political resolution, and the government has not demonstrated, in spite of very small steps in the last few weeks. And I think a few weeks is a pretty good window by which we can gauge how much political will the government has to move forward seriously. They haven't done so. Aside from hiring new security forces and recruiting Western security experts to come in and train the security forces, Bahrain has not discussed in any serious manner what the political steps are that are necessary to move forward. Forming another commission to discuss the commission report that we just got, well, I think we can see it for what it is. The answer for what needs to happen to move forward is as clear as it can be. Joost raised the question about sort of the political dynamic. What would the U.S. do to help Bahrain move forward? When I worked with Joost a few years ago with the International Crisis Group, we wrote a report that outlined a series of mechanisms that we believed would help Bahrain move beyond its dilemma then and the dilemma that it has now, and I think they're still relevant. And it all boils down to creating real mechanisms for political reform and for addressing the substantive concerns that Bahraini citizens across a landscape of political activism have been demanding over the last decade. Short of that, Bahrain's going to remain stuck. There's no clear indication that there's a willingness on either side, short of significant measures, to move forward in any meaningful way. And if Bahrain remains in precisely the same position that it is today, we'll have another conference, probably 12 months from now, talking about precisely the same dynamics.
Thanks, Toby. For Andrew, to kind of draw the focus back a little bit and look at U.S. policy and strategy in the region, I think we'd like to often think that we can bring our values and interests into harmony. Unfortunately, that's not always true, and I think Bahrain is one of those places where those two things are really in very great tension. Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, it's obviously, first off, it's a great honor to be on this panel, but it's a little tough to contribute to a conversation on Bahrain specifically, given the the expertise that I have to my right. It's also tough for me to contribute to this conversation because most of my own work on the region has been elsewhere, has been in the Levant and North Africa. And to the degree that our policy is linked to our posture, there's really a divide within the Arabic-speaking world between the Levant and North Africa and the Gulf. We have, of course, forces postured in the Levant and North Africa, but none of them are in the Arabic-speaking countries or the Hebrew-speaking country for that matter. They're in places like Turkey, Germany, Italy, and when you see the forces that the U.S. was able to bring to bear through the NATO coalition in Libya, that's where those forces came from. It's different, of course, when you talk about the Gulf states. And the United States is in a really difficult position because in a region that is rapidly democratizing, or that we hope is democratizing, we are over-invested in those states that are the least democratic states in the region. Well, why are we so heavily invested in the Gulf? Well, for two reasons that we state. First off is the one you all know, the access to hydrocarbon resources and the continued flow of oil and natural gas out of the Persian Gulf into through the Straits of Hormuz. The second is operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of our command and control nodes, a lot of our air power is based within the Gulf region. Now, Toby makes a very eloquent argument and has made this argument in several other fora that really you don't need all those U.S. forces in the Gulf because, honestly, oil will get to market. It'll find its way to the market. You don't need the United States Navy to get it there. And then second, our operations in Afghanistan will decrease over the next 10 years. Our operations in Iraq will decrease over the next 25 days. And we will not, perhaps, need the U.S. military infrastructure as far as the command and control network, as far as the Air Force infrastructure in the Gulf that we have thus far had over the past decade or so. But the irony here is that even if we were to decide, okay, let's reduce our posture in the Gulf, if we're over-invested in these countries that are not democratic, that are standing in the way of democratic reforms, let's reduce our posture. The problem that you have from the perspective of policymakers is, okay, you reduce your posture, but then your leverage goes down as well. So if your problem is, okay, how do I address the behavior of the Bahraini regime, do you help or hurt your case by reducing the amount of involvement that you have with that regime? The good senator said that the key to progress in Bahrain is through dialogue. Well, okay, right now, a U.S. admiral can get a same-day meeting with the Crown Prince in Bahrain. If the Fifth Fleet moves away, is that still going to be the case? I think that's a question worth asking. Second, and these are two kind of twin appeals to humility. First off, if we have a lesson from Iraq and Afghanistan, as we have tried to wage a kind of counter-war in both countries since 2007 and address drivers of conflict in both countries, what we've tried to do is create the security conditions whereby either A, some kind of peaceful political process can go forward, or B, some type of political reconciliation process can go forward, okay? So when you're talking about doing counterinsurgency or foreign internal defense, all you're really trying to do is set the conditions for that to go forward. But you need a good political strategy. to make use of the leverage that you have over the host nation governments. Unlike, say, for instance, the British in Northern Ireland, we're not the host nation in Iraq or Afghanistan. We're waging these campaigns on behalf of a third party. And why do I bring that up? We have thus far proven ourselves pretty incompetent at using our political leverage over these host nations to embark upon political reforms that we believe are necessary for the long-term stability of both of these countries. And then second, I grew interested in the Arabic-speaking world when I was 23 years old. I was a Ranger platoon leader, and it was the year 2003, and some genius thought it'd be a good idea for us to pursue regime change or change the disposition of the regime in Baghdad. Now, I think that there is a middle ground between violent overthrow of a regime and regime change that way, and between simply doing nothing and pretending like these human rights violations don't exist in Bahrain or pretending like we don't have a role whatsoever. But I'm not sure what this middle ground is. I think there is a smarter way that we can do security force assistance, that we can do foreign military sales and foreign military assistance, but I'm not sure the best way in which we can do that and still maximize our leverage going forward. And that, I think, is one of the real dilemmas that U.S. policymakers have in the regime or in the region as they think about how they can affect the behavior and disposition of the regime itself. And I'll leave it at that and open for questions.
Thanks, Andrew. If I could just go to Brian for one question. Looking at the reasons why the U.S. is invested with a number of these governments, especially in the Gulf, I mean, Iran is clearly a big issue. Lining up support, trying to contain Iran, trying to reassure allies that we are on top of what Iran is trying to do. The Bassiouni report made clear that there was no evidence of Iranian interference. Yet this is still obviously something that the government in Bahrain clearly believes, even if that evidence doesn't exist.
What the report says actually is that the government of Bahrain could produce no evidence to tie the democracy protests to Iran. And the king, in his official response to the summary that Sharif Bassiouni gave that day, a couple of Wednesdays ago, conceded that, although he also complained about the propaganda value that Iran was getting out of this. And the Bahrain government has apparently since said that it has evidence, but it's just too secret to tell everybody that there are these links. So I'm not sure that anybody who's a serious analyst of this, on either side actually, or any of these sides, really thinks that there is a hidden hand of Tehran in this. No.
All right, let's turn to the audience, please. And again, please just identify yourself and your affiliation, if you could, when I'm calling you. Right here.
This is a question for Toby. Ben Bernheim with the Washington Times. Ben Bernheim with the Washington Times, and this is a question for Toby, but any of you can feel free to jump in. And first, observation that in general discussions about the situation in Bahrain tend to focus on the relationship between the government, the royal family, and the predominantly Shiite opposition. But there's, of course, a third force in this, which is the Sunni street, which is with the government or even more extreme than the government or has become more extreme than the government. What role do you see them playing in the future? And, are they bound to play a destructive role? Or, what can we do, or what can the Bahraini government do to engage them and make sure that, if you could speak to that.
Right. Thanks. Well, right. This is true. And we should keep in mind that the opposition in its various forms represents the majority of Bahrainis, right? So the government's supporters are relatively small. I mean, if we use demography or the sectarian identity, and we shouldn't necessarily, in fact, I would encourage against it, but the Shiite community is at least 60% of the island's sort of indigenous population, right? So much of the opposition comes from that community. When the government responded to events in March, it used sectarianism as a wedge issue to frighten its base and to frighten its supporters, made the claim about Iranian interference as a kind of utilitarian approach to dealing with the short-term political crisis. In doing so, it played upon longstanding fears about the irredentist nature of the Shiite community. Is it a fifth column for Iran? Whatever spiritual connections Shias in Bahrain claim to maintain, is there some sort of hidden hand that guides them politically? Now, I've spent a lot of time in Bahrain. Brian spent a lot of time in Bahrain. There's simply no evidence for it. But the government stoked those anxieties anyway. And very clearly by March, April, May, it had unleashed something that it couldn't control because these forces, this community, and the supporters became more than outspoken. They became mobilized politically, and they appropriated not just the lens of sectarianism, but the most vile kinds of sectarian language that you can think of. And it goes on. It continues to today. Now, I don't think the government has a long-term interest in trying to sort of harness this. The question is what to do about it. You know, can they tone down that rhetoric? Can they rein in those forces? They absolutely can. Its base is entirely dependent. Bahrain, like oil-producing states, is responsible for doling out patronage. It manages the economy. All privilege and all reward comes from them. If the government had the political will to tip the balance and to change the political tone, it could do so. There might be some members of the Sunni community or the pro-Khalifa community that aren't willing to go far enough, but that's the risk you run in coming up with a reasoned policy to dealing with the crisis, I think.
In the back.
Hi, it's Peter Fettner, a blogger. It's often thought that, we need to make a choice between what's in America's interests in terms of maintaining influence in the Middle East and pursuing our ideals, okay? But hasn't the Arab Spring suggested that actually we can gain more influence, we can gain more power and more leverage in the Middle East by supporting democracy, that's what most of the people in the Middle East want. And if we're clearly on the side of democracy, we'll do well there, okay? If we're not clearly on the side of democracy and we support autocratic regimes, we'll do poorly. So aren't we actually hurting ourselves the more we help the less moderate al-Khalifas? And the more we sort of buy into their notion of, guarding against Iran and, continuing Bush's sort of militaristic approach, why shouldn't we pursue democracy in order to gain power, in order to gain influence, especially at a time when we're very low in Arab public opinion right now? I mean, what I'm saying, is it really a choice between pursuing our interests and maintaining our influence? Haven't things changed so much with the Arab Spring that those projects are closely linked instead of making a choice? That's how to do it. To really pursue democracy in a genuine way, not just a rhetorical way, is to increase American power.
Who would like to address that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. It's, I think that a question that a lot of policymakers and analysts and students of the region have been asking themselves is, can you, make that dichotomy between values and interests after the Arab Spring? To what degree are your values, inextricably linked, and to what degree are you going to be held responsible for what choices you make in terms of your values? The other argument, which is one that this organization, the Project on Middle East Democracy, has been making for the past several years, is that these authoritarian regimes that have been ruling the Middle East are fundamentally unstable. And that the United States is pursuing a foolish policy by having all their chips on the table with some of these regimes. The problem that just if I could argue the other side of the coin, is that from where do we derive leverage? And I think that's a question that is very much up for debate within political science. Do you derive leverage from mill ties? We can argue, for example, that if you take two different regimes, the regime in Syria, the regime in Egypt, the difference between those two regimes, or one difference between those two regimes prior to 2011, is that the United States had a long-standing military partnership with the regime in Egypt that went back 30 years prior to 2011, and has no such relationship with the military in Syria. You can see the way that the course of the revolution is taken in Egypt. It's been violent, and the military has been violent in the way that it's cracked down on protests, especially recently. But there is an argument there that the United States was able to push Mubarak from power more or less peacefully because of that long-standing military relationship. In Syria, by contrast, we've been entirely consistent with our values, and yet we can't do much for the Syrian people. So I think it's the calculus is maybe a little bit harder than just a black and white choice between values and interests.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly the right question. And my short answer is yes, that democracy as a long-term strategy will sort of will shift the region in ways that would diminish the significance or diminish the need for the Americans to project a certain kind of power, the perception that Americans need to pursue a certain kind of power. So I think the question before us is partly how will the United States define its interests in an era after the Arab Spring? And what are those going to be? And it's not clear what that's going to be. Right now, it seems that the American response, as imperfect as it is in a lot of places, is still sort of trapped in precisely this kind of inability to calculate clearly what American interests are going to be after the Arab Spring. So, if you play it forward, if the U.S. would commit fully to pursuing democratic reform, that could very well play out in the next 5 to 10 years in a very useful way that diminishes the need for a military presence. But there are short-term risks in doing so. I don't think the risks are as significant as the rewards, but that's part of the strategic sort of uncertainty here. And it can't be dismissed entirely. So I think the question is exactly right. The implicit point is exactly right. The question is how to get there in the most effective way. And I don't know the answer to that.
I think just to make a comment, I'll say something that you probably don't hear someone from the Center for American Progress say often, and that's I want to give George W. Bush some credit for recognizing that in the long run, overinvestment in the regimes of these authoritarian rulers is a losing one. I think his administration made some choices and pursued some policies that unfortunately exacerbated this problem and sort of drove us back into the arms of these same rulers. But I think making that a top-line part of the U.S. agenda was very, very important. But I'm curious, on that question, Brian and Toby, having been on the ground there talking to human rights activists, what's the perception among Bahrainis, among Bahraini democracy activists, about the U.S.'s choices there? I mean, do they understand these?
Very disappointed, I have to say. Generalising here, but I was there in May, and there was much more hope that the US would intervene, at least rhetorically, in a positive way, and for a while it did. There was a visit late May, early June, I think, by Mike Posner. On May the 19th, President Obama gave a speech about the Middle East, and he specifically criticised the attacks on the Shia places of worship. He also said you can't have a real dialogue with parts of the peaceful opposition in jail. And Bahraini activists were very excited about that because it was a great thing, an accurate thing, a sensible thing to say. And then there was silence from the US, really from the middle of June right until the end of September. So even rhetorically, the US seemed to have abandoned the Bahrainis. Of course, you get from the administration, we're doing all sorts of tough talk behind doors, and perhaps they are, but that's really not being seen on the ground. I think it's fair to say that many Bahraini activists feel disappointed and abandoned by the US in terms of the public statements that it's making. I'm not saying that Europe's been great on this, but some of the other countries, France particularly, have been notably better than the US.
Yeah, and we've identified the same level of outrage, and frankly, I think this is has the potential to very quickly turn in a more, and not just a frustrated direction, but the legacy of the American response, in parallel or in tandem with the brutality of the crackdown. I think it's very possible that if this remains unresolved and the Americans aren't seen as playing a productive role, that Bahraini citizens aren't going to be so interested in what American interests are and thinking about how useful the Fifth Fleet actually is to them. And I'm not predicting an era of radicalism or violence. I think that might be going a bit too far. But if the Arab Spring is a good measure for the actual stability of these regimes, one way or another, Bahrain is going to have to deal with an era of mass politics in which its citizens are mobilized, have expectations, and are willing to get shot at for political change. That changes the political dynamic. And if they have a more assertive role in Bahraini politics going forward, let's say they achieve some semblance of reform in spite of U.S. policy, what then are going to be the consequences for American interests in the Gulf, right? If they remember very clearly that the U.S. didn't help them get where they ultimately get to.
Up here in front.
Alexandra Blackman with the Carnegie Endowment. My question, I just want to make a comment, and then I have a question for all the panelists. My comment is about Andrew's latest comments about leverage. And I would just caution against, I think there's a very fine line between maintaining U.S. leverage and becoming complicit in repression of protesters, and I think we have to kind of think about this issue more. So my first comment leads to my first question, which is for Toby. I know that you've written about Bahraini-based politics, and I was wondering if you could kind of comment on Andrew's opinion, what he's put forward about leverage. And then I also want to ask all the panelists, in light of the explosion yesterday, do any of your considerations change about, whether or not the regime is somehow, making this explosion seem like Iran is involved in Bahrain more than it is? Do you think it is actually just a random explosion that happened? People are saying it was an attack on the British embassy. So if you could all just make a small comment about how that might force us to reconsider what's going on in Bahrain.
You want to comment on the leverage question?
No, I would actually just concur with what you said. I mean, I think you're right. That is the dilemma that policymakers have. How do you keep up your leverage? How do you have an effective security force assistance program, effective foreign military sales, but at the same time, not allow those weapons to be used against, to have some sort of checks that those weapon systems aren't going to be used against peaceful protesters, to make sure that you're not going to be seen as being complicit in a crackdown against, democracy movements. And this happens even when the United States exports non-lethal technologies. Find folks in Tahrir Square right now that'll show you gas canisters that say "Made in the USA." It's not exactly great for, no matter how many episodes of Oprah get broadcast, it doesn't make up for the fact that that's a pretty nasty public diplomacy message that we're sending when even non-lethal technologies are being used in an abusive way. So, I don't know. I think you've just put your finger on exactly what the dilemma is. I just concur completely with your remark.
And the Bahrainis would show you physical evidence that non-lethal technologies actually are lethal.
Quite lethal, yeah.
So tear gas canisters hitting somebody in the head, fired at close range, doesn't do so well for one's head, right? Andrew signaled to it in his comments, and you raised the question about what my take on base politics has been. I disagree with the line. It's not Andrew's line, but I disagree with the argument that the base gives us a certain kind of leverage to be effective. I disagree with it in the absence of seeing it actually being effective. Getting a phone call with the king is not the same thing as changing the king's behavior, or sort of producing some kind of change on the ground. Look, so I'm a historian, right? And I'm engaged in a series of broad questions about what it is that informs our security policy. And I'm interested in this over time. I'm interested in the moment. Historically, the principle behind our military presence in the Gulf is about energy security, and it's based on a certain political economic understanding of how the energy market works globally. And the argument goes like this. Oil is a scarce resource. Its flow to global markets has to be protected in order to stabilize prices, in order to stabilize the global economy. But what if the political economic argument is a myth? What if oil is not a scarce resource? Now, I'm a liberal, and this has all kinds of consequences for environmental politics and climate change, and I'm worried about those. But in terms of national security policy specifically, what if oil is not a scarce resource, and we've devoted military resources to protecting its flow when, in fact, we don't have to protect its flow? Right? To me, the trajectory over the last 40 years has been we arm the autocrats are unstable, they have revolutions and fall. Shah in 1979. We then move into the region militarily, we put military resources on the ground, that's the Carter Doctrine. 1990, we identify rogue regimes in the region that threaten the oil flow, that's Saddam Hussein. We approach dual containment strategies, they fail, we're forced to then augment our military presence in order to protect the flow of oil. But again, what if oil is not a scarce resource? Then the entire military strategy has been based on a misunderstanding at best, right? But then the consequences can be that can be rethought. The security architecture can be rethought. The base can be rethought. The military footprint can be rethought. Now, does that lead to a diminishment of American leverage in the Gulf, potentially? Well, show me where the U.S. has been helpful in producing a meaningful political outcome in the context of the Arab Spring.
Let me add just one more comment, which is on leverage. Okay, leverage to do what? Leverage to moderate the behavior of the regime. What if the regime thinks that what you are trying to get it to do actually constitutes an existential threat to the regime itself? okay? It doesn't matter how much investment you have in the regime. It doesn't matter how many troops you have on the ground. It doesn't matter how close your relationship is with the regime. If you're asking the regime to fundamentally give up power from its perspective, it's just not going to do it. So there are cases in which the United States might have enough leverage to get the regime to do certain things, but there's a line that you cross, and that line has to do with the existential threat to the regime itself. And that's the way I think the regime in Bahrain kind of looks at the situation. So, sorry.
Just quickly on this question of leverage.
Welcome to America.
Yes, thanks.
That'd be America.
It doesn't look like, from conversations with Bahraini activists, that the US has used this leverage it has to restrain the hand of the Bahraini government. So if the equation is big military presence equals big leverage, great, but then you've got to be seen to be using it. But from the Bahraini activists' democracy movement's point of view, the US simply isn't using it. It hasn't managed to stop the repression, hasn't managed to stop the crackdown, hasn't managed to bring anybody accountable or to really produce any significant political change in Bahrain at all. On the question of the bomb, I just think that's an odd episode, and I look forward to the coming days for a bit more explanation. The British Embassy is not stuck out in the middle of nowhere. It's right next to a shopping mall. From people in Bahrain telling me yesterday, it looked as though the security forces had control of the area and the streets around from around 7 o'clock in the evening, and the bomb went off around 1 o'clock. I don't know. It seems to be a small device put at the front, underneath of a bus, not at the gas tank. I don't know what it's about. There are all sorts of conspiracy theories. Nobody, as I understand, has claimed credit for it yet. It's a bit of a mystery, a bit odd, and I hope in a week or so it will become a bit more clear, really, who planted it and why. In terms of does this link to Iran in any way? Not really. I mean, in the British press over the last couple of days, it's been part of the story tied into the attacks on the British Embassy in Tehran. But I'm not sure that's a particularly sophisticated analysis either.
One issue that, I understand that the protesters in Bahrain would be frustrated with the United States, but I can also understand why U.S. policymakers would also be frustrated, because it's, the problem we always have with conflict prevention is how do you prove a negative? Right. The United States can say, look, the reason that things weren't even worse than they were was because of what we were doing. And it's very difficult to prove that, especially difficult to prove that to a popular protest movement that's been, that's seen their friends and allies imprisoned and beaten and killed.
Sure, but there's an inconsistency here, right? So look back to May. President Obama says you can't have real dialogue with parts of the peaceful opposition in jail. And then, a month later, publicly endorsing this ridiculous national dialogue, which went nowhere, never then said, well, that was hopeless and we're sorry we endorsed it. Right. So there's just an inconsistency here. Yeah. Either you have the May position, or you have a position which says, look, it's all a bit too difficult, we can't use the leverage, and, get on with it, and we're going to keep the Fifth Fleet anyway. But to have the up and down is, I think, more frustrating than a consistent hands-off approach.
I completely understand. I just, I wish that U.S. strategy and policy were consistent. But we're not a unitary actor, or the United States government is not a unitary actor, and there are constant disagreements and, arguments being fought and won within the State Department, within the Department of Defense. Yeah. And U.S. policy is never going to be consistent towards any country.
In the back, please.
Nelson Garcia with the Washington Intergovernmental Professional Group. With the Obama administration's new focus on the Asia-Pacific region, combined with a rising of tensions with Iran, do you see the possibility that whatever is happening right now in Bahrain may get downgraded in terms of a priority under this administration?
Downgraded even more? I don't know. I mean, I don't know where it is on the list now. It doesn't seem very high. I understand that there are finite resources even in the US government, but again, the general air of neglect by the US government to Bahrain is commonly believed in Bahrain. I'm not sure that if it were downgraded, many people would notice.
Well, we haven't mentioned Saudi Arabia yet. Right. And the reality is that, as important as Bahrain is for us in the room and for Bahrainis and for lots of people, the American priority in the Gulf is Saudi Arabia, containing Iran, And on this, the Saudis and the Americans and the Israelis speak with one voice. So yeah, Bahrain is gonna rank somewhere well below. And you brought up Egypt as the place where the U.S. is most engaged in terms of feeling out how democratic transition is going to go. Bahrain is not at the top of the priority list, but it hasn't been. So,
This gentleman right here.
Mark Henkin from the Solidarity Center. So, given the word that finally Saudi Arabia was mentioned, I'd like to ask a question, which is, you have an authoritarian regime in Saudi Arabia, and you have a less than democratic regime, certainly in Bahrain, neither of which wants to see political change. How does one design a policy with, quote unquote, progressive forces within the government structure of Bahrain to overcome those challenges?
well, look, U.S. policy on Bahrain has been to support political reform since 2001. And the Americans have been engaged on this. The National Democratic Institute used to be on the island. And the government has certainly supported the transition towards more political participation. But we know in the Bush administration and even early on in the Obama administration that they often pointed to Bahrain as an exemplary model for what was possible. Now, whether that was realistic or not, it was hard to know. But the balance of forces in Bahrain, the balance of political forces in Bahrain, were the ones that the U.S. has identified now as the moderates, the Crown Prince and the King and the others. The Prime Minister was always somebody who was important, but was willing to tolerate the kind of limited, baby, provisional, some might say not real steps towards political reform that have developed over the last decade or so. So the U.S. is left with a dilemma, and that is that the moderate forces, in its terms, that it hopes to empower, have not really demonstrated a willingness to move towards a more genuine democratic change over the last decade. And that's the best they can hope for. And the reality on the ground in Bahrain is that that's as good as it's going to get in the short term. But it's not very promising given the broader sort of constellation of political forces working against it. Now in Saudi Arabia, there are progressive members of the royal family. Maybe there are 5 of them. And they're third-generation kids who are studying at the U.S. and right now. No, so I'm being kind of flippant, but there are people in Saudi Arabia that are interested in political reform, but they're in a much less difficult position than Bahrain. Is they're wealthier, they're bigger, they have a more powerful coercive apparatus. Saudis live, and I wrote this in The Nation back in September. Saudis live with a real sense of dread about what the consequences of political action and activism would be. So the costs are very, very high. I think if Saudi Arabia sort of went the way of the Arab Spring, you'd be looking at a Syria response. That's how the regime would respond. What can the U.S. do if that's the real possibility? The absence of that is better than it taking shape. And part of the reason I think the Americans think this way is because they continue to cling to the ideas of energy security that I suggest are potentially problematic.
No.
Nova Robinson, Rutgers University. Prior to February 14th, 2011, there was a long-standing tradition in Bahrain of appropriating Western rhetoric and retooling it to continue with its existing programs and ideologies. The example I have in mind is the Supreme Council on Women and how it adopted gender programming and mirrored the language of women's rights, but then actually didn't really implement much change at all, but was able to have it on the books as an example of supporting women's rights. And so I guess the question that emerges out of this history is, what are the metrics available to us to gauge Bahraini national government rhetoric versus reality and measure whether or not the programs suggested and the changes suggested in the report are actually implemented?
I think there's some important and rudimentary ones, like stop torturing people, drop charges against people who have not had due process, which is hundreds of people. Release people from prison who shouldn't be there. If you start with those things, then you can grow into more sophisticated matrix. But until those things happen, I don't think that there's any way forward, really. We hear a lot about the strength of the family and the military strength of Bahrain and so on, and it reminds me a bit of Charles Darwin, and his work is often mischaracterized as being about the survival of the fittest and the survival of the strongest. And really that's not what he was saying. He was saying that those species which can best adapt to new environments are the ones which will survive. And I think the ruling family in Bahrain really needs to mutate if it's going to survive in this new political atmosphere. I don't think there is any going back to last year or the year before. The relationship between the people who govern and the governed in Bahrain and across the region is different now and forever. And I think the test for the ruling family is whether or not they're smart enough and whether or not they are prepared to change enough to survive in a new political atmosphere. But it doesn't look like it at the moment.
No, but let me give you sort of a quick response. What I think the government's going to do. I don't think it's going to engage in systematic political reform. I think it's going to look for ways to talk about political reform while doing something else. And that's attempting to destroy the opposition. Carve off al-Wafaq as a partner that it can talk to while it tries to marginalize the February 14th movement. The problem is that al-Wafaq has to answer to the February 14th. It's not al-Wafaq bringing kids out into the street. They're not the ones who are protesting. It's these young people who organized February 14th and disobeyed the opposition by mobilizing in the first place. That's a doomed strategy for the government. The problem is it's worked in the past. So for all it's taught, you bring about the Supreme Council for Women, this is just, it's emblematic, the broader approach to dealing with particular issues in the community. In fact, women were an issue that it used to co-opt al-Wafaq the first time. Right, it was able to sell women out ultimately and codified family reform and all of that stuff. So don't look for the government to all of a sudden find real meaning in political reform. Look for it to pursue strategies that will allow it to attempt to outmaneuver it. It's kind of cynical, but I think we've got a track record.
Okay, do we have any last questions? Okay, right here.
Hi, Alice Caston with NDI. So given that governments don't usually make decisions based on what the right thing to do is, and given that the Bahraini government seems to be telling itself that it can make cosmetic changes and wait for this to blow over, how would you try to convince the king, for example, if you had a private meeting with him, that it's in his best interest, in the best interest of his regime, to make meaningful reforms, or is it just completely not in their best interest and it's probably never going to happen unless the regime is overthrown?
I'd tell them it's not 2010 anymore. This is a totally new era of Arab politics. It's completely changed. You're not going to get away with it anymore. Bahrainis aren't going to settle for less.
Even with Saudi Arabia backing
February 14th doesn't care what Saudi Arabia thinks. I mean, I'm talking low-level street protests, political mobilization will go on, and they're going to either have to be destroyed or they're going to have to be accommodated.
I'd point him to a speech given, I think, in 1979 by P.W. Botha when he became Prime Minister of South Africa, in apartheid South Africa, and he told his constituents they either had to adapt or die, and they didn't heed that advice, and in fact, Botha didn't really heed it himself, and the regime collapsed, rightly so. And I think this is an adapt or die moment for the Al Khalifa family in terms of the survival of the old politics. I don't think that it's 2010 anymore, and it's going to be radically different from now on. Unless they adapt, then that old system is going to collapse under the weight of its own corruption and nepotism.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay, I think we'll take one last. Okay, get two more right there in the back, in the very back, and then.
Steve Winters, local researcher and actually a Hopkins alumnus. There's an extremely prolific Arab American blogger, without mentioning any names, who runs a news service out of his blog, which is widely influential in the Middle East and widely read in the U.S. also. Now, he is very critical of the contradictions in U.S. policy, and he's very pro-human rights. But just to mention that as one example, could the panel comment on the role of blogs such as that in influencing the political dynamic in Bahrain and its development?
Yeah, I think the question of new media, not only blogs but social media, Twitter, Facebook, in these protests has been discussed. Some have said it's overdone. Others have argued that no, they were instrumental. I'm interested myself in hearing and what some of you might think.
I'll defer to Toby on the kind of the newer social media, but I think that Mark Lynch's book on the emerging Arab public sphere that took place in kind of the 1990s is still just as relevant today as it was when it was published a few years ago. When you see satellite newspapers being able to be published in London but printed same day in Tangier, Baghdad, Damascus, Bahrain, when you see the emergence of Arabic language satellite networks, this is one of the tough things for the U.S. government because we have interests that vary from state to state, yet this has very much been a regional phenomenon, in part because people in Tahrir can see what's taking place in Tunisia. People in Bahrain can see what's taking place in Tahrir. People in Damascus can see what's taking place in Bahrain. And you see the way in which kind of an emergent discourse has kind of unified the Arabic-speaking world. Now, granted, what has determined whether or not regimes have stayed in place or fallen, or the individual, characteristics of each revolution and uprising have been localized, but you have had that common Arab discourse, I think, that has affected what's taken place in 2011.
Yeah, I came to Twitter in March, so I'm a novice compared to these two guys. But it's remarkable, the role that both blogging historically, say over the last decade, has played in Bahrain in particular, but also in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, but that Twitter also played, Facebook, and allowing people to communicate with one another, to mobilize. For me, it acts as a news service. Bahrainis are able to be in touch with me directly where they might feel uncomfortable. And that's been useful for them and for me in lots of different ways. But there are limits. From late March through early June, there was the crackdown in Bahrain was incredible for its depth and breadth and scope. Critical tweeters, people who might have had something, they might have just simply observed an event and remarked on it, went to jail. Mm-hmm. People who blogged about it went to jail, including people who had promoted reconciliation and had been critical of the opposition. So at a particular moment in the spring and the early summer, the Bahrain sort of social media landscape went silent. So there are also real limits on the ability of people to sort of do this successfully.
Yeah, apparently the regime did not take retweet is not an endorsement seriously.
Right. Yeah, Chris Shivers, who's writes under the byline CJ Shivers for the New York Times and has covered the conflict in Libya particularly well, wrote a book about the AK-47. And the AK-47 has this, this iconic appeal as this tool of liberation. It's the weapon of liberation. And Shivers makes the point that actually when this AK-47 is first employed in Eastern Europe, it's actually to repress popular protests in Eastern Europe, rising up against the Soviet satellite states. And I think technology, what Toby gets at is in the same way that you can see Facebook and Twitter being used to organize popular protests and as a pro-democracy tool, it can also be used by autocracies to repress democracy movements. The only thing I would add is the slacktivist phenomenon as well. So I think it's useful data point that I think there were about 20,000 people in Tahrir Square before the Egyptian regime shut off the internet and more importantly, shut off cell phones. As soon as the Egyptian regime shuts off the internet and cell phones, then suddenly people can't retweet the revolution. They can't call their friends. They actually have to get out on the street, see what's happening. And the population in Tahrir swells from 20,000 to 120,000 almost overnight. So that'd be the only other mitigating factor I'd throw into the equation.
I think we've got one last quick question.
Is it on? Thank you all for a great presentation. I was wondering, it seems that every voice that is opposing in Bahrain is being silenced, from what I understand. And is there going to be real change if that is the case, if everybody is being thrown in jail? What comes to my mind is adaptability, because so far we've seen that this is a very nonviolent movement. I'm wondering if the protesters might resort to more violent means, whether extremism, terrorism, in order to advance their cause with the reluctance of the government to actually make serious changes.
It would be no surprise. Certainly from when I was there in May, I was there in July, and then I was there a couple of weeks ago, and the tone of protests is changing. You're seeing tyre burning now, you're seeing kids, teenagers around the villages setting up these rudimentary checkpoints to let people in and out. It's very dangerous. That's a very worrying step. I would be surprised if there are no more reforms, if there is no space for the opposition to debate these things in traditional media, if things don't get worse. Yeah, I think that's predictable and almost inevitable.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Any last comments, gentlemen? All right, well, thank you all very much. I want to thank the panelists here for a great discussion.